In this episode, we're going to cover building the web frames, gluing everything together, and building the top. As a disclaimer, this video is organised by logical sequence, not necessarily chronological order. The video making process makes this a little bit funny at times. The boards for the top go through the standard milling process: cut to length, jointing, thicknessing, then ripping at the bandsaw. The offcut from the bandsaw will be saved for draw material later. So these boards for the tops of the cabinets have turned out pretty good. The next step is to glue them up. I'm a belts and suspenders type of guy. I always wear 2 layers of PPE. I have my dust collection and air scrubber on and all of that. So for this, I'm going to use the domino for alignment purposes. You can obviously use a biscuit jointer for the same thing, or nothing at all, and just use corbs to make sure that the boards don't shift during glue up. Because this is a little bit longer than what the final dimensions will be, so that again, if they shift, it's fine, I can cut it off. I want to avoid putting them too close to the edge, just in case they get exposed. So I'm coming in 100mm from both ends. Domino every 100mm, so that'll make 5 total per glue up, per edge join, so there'll be 10 on each of the tops. With the tabletops glued up and dried, they can be cut to size, and this can be a tricky cut if you're trying to do it on the table saw, because these two ends are not square. If you have a track saw, this is a fantastic application for track saws. Circular saw with a guide will work just as well. And if you don't have either of those, you can use a tapering jig, or sometimes known as a straight line jig. You could certainly use a crosscut sled. My crosscut sled is not this deep. Once I've got the straight edge on this end, I can flip it and actually measure from here to the other end, so it maintains square and is the size that I actually want it. So I want a very shallow bevel, or I suppose very extreme chamfer, on the underside of the top. To do that with a router bit, you really need a panel raising bit, and frankly those terrify me because they're about 90mm to get what I want in terms of radius, and I have about 1mm clearance on the router table for that, for the opening, which that doesn't sound fun to me. The other way is to use the table saw and tilt the blade, but this is a relatively large panel to be running through vertically. So I've got a auxiliary fence. This is just a piece of MDF that is then screwed into a piece of plywood. Plywood has some holes in it for clamps, and that's holding it to the fence. That way I can safely run it through vertically on the table saw. However, to make it even safer, I've got an auxiliary runner. This is just an offcut that happens to be fairly square. Place that on top of my auxiliary fence and clamp the workpiece to it. The blade's tilted about 10 degrees, as I said, and it's spaced probably 20mm away from the auxiliary fence, so there's no real danger of it hitting the screws. You could obviously glue that all together, but it's not cutting into the fence, so it's not really a concern. Because watching someone else sand isn't all that fun off camera, I have finished sanded these tabletops up to 180 grit. They're now ready for stain, and I'll be using the Livos Caldet range of stains. This is dark teak. This is a transparent stain, so it's really just going to make the wood look lightly toasted. It's probably the best way to describe it. It turns out initially I had the method incorrect for Caldet, though it was correct for tinted Kunos. With Caldet, brush the stain on, following the grain, and that's it. No need to wipe it off. If there are any drips or runs after 10 minutes, brush along the grain with a wet brush, either with solvent or more Caldet, and you're done. It takes about 12 hours to dry. The side frames this section of the side frame will receive the same stain as the top. But before they can be stained, they need to be finish sanded. Before they can be finish sanded, they need all the joinery finally added to the legs. And the final part of that puzzle is the web frames. So the web frames will look, well, exactly like this. This is one of them. They'll be attached to all 4 legs. You could do this with dominoes, as I'm going for. Regular mortise and tenon, stub tenons. You can just notch it out and make it a half lap, or dowels will also work, and they are all fairly common techniques for attaching web frames. Web frames provide a few benefits for cabinets like this. They are more beneficial to larger furniture like tall boys, which will often have a lot more weight in them and be a lot wider drawers. On those wider cabinets, they may have the same sort of dimensions, 40mm leg, 40mm stretchers, and they might just not have enough structure basically to keep the whole cabinet from racking or from otherwise being a little bit wobbly. Having the web frames go between all 4 legs, and there's 1 web frame per drawer, really stiffens up the entire structure. Apart from providing more integrity to the overall structure, these provide somewhere for the drawers to sit on. I'm not using any sort of metal runners. Instead, the drawer is just going to be sitting on top of the web frame and will slide in and out. The wider surface, 40mm on each side, provides somewhere so the drawer is just not going to fall into the one below it. And I can glue on strips onto the side to help guide it as well, so that it doesn't skew inside the frame and panel design. On the web frame above each drawer, I could also glue on what's known as a kicker, I believe. That'll help keep the drawer flat as you extend it out, so it doesn't tip down dramatically, as that can then be quite disastrous as it falls out onto your toes. The web frames will be attached to the side frames at the same time that the long aprons are, but that means that all the joinery for the web frames needs to be done first, so that the side frames can be sanded, finished, glued up, all that sort of stuff. Very little of the web frames are actually visible, so to save myself a fair bit of resawing and wasted stock, I'm cutting everything into 25mm strips, and I will glue on extra parts to get the width that I need. Each front and back member of the web frame receives 4 mortises, 2 on the sides, 2 on the back. This positive stop clamp to my bench makes it much easier to rotate the piece to cut all the slots. The lowest front and back web frames actually integrate into the long curved lower aprons. To make this seamless, the 2 pieces need to be joined, and to do that, a shallow rebate, only about 2mm deep, is cut onto the back side of the apron. To accommodate the front lower rail, the matching web frame part has some width ripped from it. After the lamination, the web frame members are sanded to 180 grit. The front members then have a 1/8 inch radius roundover routed on the top and bottom of the front face. To make the final glue up less stressful, the web frame is glued into a C-frame. The back member won't actually be glued into the front and side pieces, only into the overall frame. While researching, this was a common theme in many web frame examples, with the back piece not glued into the side pieces and having elongated mortises to counteract any issues with wood movement. The web frames require consistent placement of all the mortises to be square and to maintain even spacing and sizing of the drawers. The easiest way to do this is not by measuring, but by using a story stick type jig that I can reference off. Since I'm using the domino, creating a discount aerial structure provides a square reference point. Using Starbond's black superglue, it's quickly bonded, then I added an extra screw just for a little more insurance. Very little pressure is on this part, so perhaps that was overkill. The story stick is then clamped to the leg flush with the top and bottom, then the domino can be used on each step of the ladder. In the lower and upper rails, I have pre-glued in the tenons so that I can do a dry fit, and I know that the mortise that matches up with this particular tenon was cut just a millimetre or two too low. So to counteract that, I can just pare off just a little bit off the end of this domino, and it'll give me the wriggle room I need to get everything nice and flush. Glue ups are one of those things that can stress a lot of people out, but there are a lot of little tricks you can do to make it a lot less stressful and just a slow dance, I suppose. At the moment, I'm gluing up one of the side assemblies, so it's the two legs, upper and lower rails, and a panel. At the moment, I am doing a dry fit, and this is one of the things that people often miss out on doing, which is making sure that all the parts actually fit. The other benefit to doing a dry fit, apart from making sure everything fits, is you can get out how many clamps you need ahead of time. I've mentioned it plenty of times, but I typically, for joinery glue ups, use a hide glue, specifically Type Bond's liquid hide glue. Hide glues are a much slower setting than PVAs, and strength-wise, so long as you're talking about interior applications where they're not exposed to moisture, just as strong, at least real world strong. If it's a high stress part, maybe you're looking at epoxy or something like that, but they'll create a bond that is stronger than the wood itself. Having that longer open time makes glue ups a lot less stressful as you're not rushing. There are other benefits to liquid hide glue as well. It doesn't swell the joints like PVA does. It's not a water-based glue. Alright, I'm happy with my dry fit now. Everything is nice and square. Acid brushes are great for glue ups like this, particularly if you cut them down. This is the length of a normal acid brush, so I've cut that in half. Makes the bristles a little bit stiffer, makes it a lot easier to get glue where you mean it. The glued sides receive a stopped rebate at the router table. As this is on the back, it's just eyeballed to roughly where I need to be. To get the rebate exactly where it needs to go, it can be chopped with a chisel. Taking small slices off at a time is much easier than taking large chunks out and stops the chisel from wedging forward or backwards. Pretty happy with how the dry fit is going, so it is time to move on to actually assembling the whole thing. But before I get to that, the front piece of each web frame needs to be sanded, rounded over on the very sharp edges, and have stain applied to it because it's just easier to do before gluing everything up. And before I get too far ahead in the gluing process, I need to look at how to attach the tabletop. Might seem a little bit out of sync, out of step, thinking about attaching the tabletop now, but really before assembly is the best time to do it. For example, on the long stretches, we need to have something that holds down the tabletop. And if this was all glued in, it's going to limit what options we've got to get tools in there. I like to use Z-clips. Z-clips allow for plenty of wood movement, and they're actually pretty easy to both install and to cut the slots for. In my case, I'll be using the Domino with a 5mm cutter, but biscuit jointers happen to be about the same size too, so they can cut the slot for that as well very, very easily. Or you can use the table saw or even router table to create a groove along the length that will accept the Z-clip. It just needs to be down far enough that it will slot in, so it goes that way if the top is on like so, and that'll allow side-to-side movement and in and out. Looking at all the different types of tabletop attachments is a little bit outside the scope of this video series, so if you are interested, let me know in the comments below and I can put a video together specifically looking at a whole bunch of different ways at how to attach a tabletop, desktop, side tabletop, whatever you want to call it, that allows for wood movement, meaning you won't get horribly warped furniture or worse, cracked furniture. The big glue up was stressful, but using all the tips I mentioned previously, it actually went really quite smoothly. I cannot overstress how important a dry fit clamp up is. So that's come together very nicely. I'm very happy with the subtle under chamfer, whatever you want to call that. There is some light cleanup to do on the web frames, but overall everything's going together pretty well. On the back, the rebate makes a lot more sense now. The web frames don't extend all the way past that rebate so that the plywood panel can sit in. Plywood panel will provide, well, the back of the panel to the cabinet, so that'll stop things falling through. However, that's going to go on much later. When the drawers are installed, we can look at gluing on some runners to make sure the drawer doesn't shift, as well as the kickers so that the drawers don't tip. Thanks for watching.